Let's talk about trauma and let's talk about adult relationships. This is an interesting conversation because there's a lot of videos out there about trauma, what that could look like, childhood trauma, different forms of abuse, whether it's emotional, physical, and there's also plenty of videos out there about dating and relationships and blah, 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 how to become more attractive and this and that. One thing that I've always found really interesting is whenever you look at those dating coaches or those people who talk about how to get into relationships, how to be more attractive, how to go on more dates, they fail to talk about a lot of evidence-based practices, meaning things that have been studied. Now, when you're looking at psychology and research and things that have been studied, things that have studies backing them, one of the most pivotal and most influential people, especially when you're looking at trauma, was Dr. Sigmund Freud. Now, follow me here. Freud shows up and he goes, something happens in childhood. People don't just forget. They hold on to it, consciously or unconsciously, for years to come, okay? His daughter, Anna Freud, continues this line of thinking, and then she does some modifications to that stuff. Later on, a young lady by the name of Mary Ainsworth comes along, and she introduces one of the most influential theories when it comes to relationships, and that's called attachment theory. See, what Ainsworth had discovered, or what she'd proposed rather, is young children have different attachment styles with their parents. Now, they change the names around, and this is not going to be a video focused on that. That'll be a whole other video in and of itself. But maybe you've heard of things like, oh, she has a secure attachment style. This person has an ambivalent attachment style. This person has an anxious avoidant attachment style. And essentially what these represent are the way that someone responds or is encouraged to go towards someone when something goes wrong. For example, and they did a study where mom's playing with a kid, mom leaves, they'd watch the kid's reaction, and then mom comes back. And what they found was some kids, when mom left, would start crying a crazy amount, and when mom came back, they'd cling to her and they wouldn't stop crying. Other kids, when mom left, they'd start crying, or they wouldn't care. Mom came back, they didn't really care, they'd just kind of ignore her. And there'd be other kids where they're playing with mom, mom leaves, they cry, mom comes back, and as soon as she comes back, the kid starts smiling again. Anyways, long story short, we form these very important attachment styles at a young age. Now here's where it gets interesting, and here's what I think is such a big gap when you look at dating coaches and relationship experts. There's so many videos on, here's how to date, here's how to do online dating, here's how to be more shy, blah, blah. But what they fail to recognize is the importance of attachment styles when giving people advice on what to do. Here's how you talk on a first date. You should go up to 100 women and ask them out and all that stuff, not recognizing that the way people form relationships and attach is different. And when we don't acknowledge those things, when we don't tailor advice to individuals, we end up doing a one-size-fits-all approach. We just assume that everybody has a secure attachment style and then we go from there. But what if you don't? Well, if you don't, it's going to be a little bit tougher. Studies point that people with secure attachment styles are going to have more confidence in their partner, that they'll stay faithful, and they'll stay faithful themselves, and that they feel more comfortable reaching out to their partner in times of distress. Whereas maybe someone with an anxious ambivalent attachment style has a need to be more clingy, to hold on to their partner, to keep calling, to keep where are you? Where are you going to be? What are you up to? I'm thinking about you, like in a worried sense. And then this shapes how we have relationships later on in our lives, whether it be with our coworkers, platonic ones, whether it be friendships, or whether it be romantic relationships. So think about this for a moment. What happens if a child is growing up in a home or house filled with... Okay, let's not even go to abuse right now. Let's talk about the M word that is key when we're around children. The M word that I'm talking about is modeling. They did this experiment. I believe this was under Dr. Albert Bandura, who recently passed away. They said, look, we're going to have mom come into this room, and there's a see-through wall. And we're going to have mom kick this Bobo doll and punch it and kick it. Okay? And then mom, when you come out, we're going to let your little kid go in there, and we just want to watch and see what they do. And then they also had another group where mom went in, she didn't punch and kick the doll, and she comes out, and then the kid goes in, they want to see what they do. Now, this is not going to surprise you that kids who saw their parents going in and beating up this doll, like kind of this stuffed animal, they did the same thing. And kids who saw their parents walk in and just not hit the doll, most of them also did the same thing. They didn't hit the doll. What does that mean? That means children are very impressionable. This suggests that children learn a lot by seeing. As parents, as students, as older siblings, we act as models for them whether we realize it or not. So I want you to think about what happens when you're out at a restaurant or you're out at a store and someone speaks rudely to you. And you have a child beside you, let's say either your niece or nephew or son or younger sister. They're interacting, okay, this person just said something rude. What is Daniel going to respond with? Is he going to yell? Is he going to smile and not say anything? Is he going to get upset? And that starts to become the blueprint for how to deal with things. What about with mom and dad get into an argument? Oh, when mom and dad get into an argument, the best thing to do is to yell and then to slam the door shut. Oh, I get scared when dad starts to yell. Dad starts to yell because there's an argument, so therefore arguments are not good and I should avoid having arguments. It's things like this on the unconscious level that start to almost be ticked down in this person's brain, and as they get older, whether they realize it or not, they carry those habits and that mentality into their relationships. If you were a child and maybe you didn't receive a lot of affection from your parents, you didn't receive a lot of hugs, let's say, or kisses, what happens when you get older and you start dating and your boyfriend or girlfriend or whoever you're seeing attempts to initiate some physical intimacy, putting their arm around you, holding your hand, giving you a hug? How do you think that feels for that person who finds it foreign to them? It's very probable that their immediate reaction isn't, oh, this is nice. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from people where they're like, yeah, so-and-so put his arm around me and I felt extremely uncomfortable. And they'd go, oh, was so-and-so a stranger? Like, no, he's my, boyfriend. We've been seeing each other for 3 months. But I get uncomfortable with physical touch. So what this points to is people's love languages are different. There was a brief clip I saw on TikTok or YouTube Shorts. A psychologist was saying, look, she was directing this at men, but this goes either way. So look, you might meet a girl and she could be great and you're a great guy and you want to have a positive influence on her, but if she has a troubled past, a troubled childhood, it's going to be very difficult to connect with her. And some of the comments were disagreeing. They were saying, oh, so you're saying that people who've had trauma or baggage at a young age are unlovable or don't deserve to be in a loving relationship? And my own interpretation of this, and think about this as I'm saying this, do you agree, do you disagree, is this. When we develop certain love languages, when we develop these ideas and these values from our parents of what's right and what's wrong, how do I express the fact that I love you and that I care for you? Do I do it verbally? Like, do I see my parents at a young age? And this isn't like a conscious thing, like, oh, I remember seeing my parents saying this, like, I remember hearing this. Sometimes you're watching TV, you're 8 years old, and it could just be you hear your dad come home, and in the peripheral vision, the side of your eye, you see your dad hand your mom a bouquet of flowers. Then you see a smile on your mom's face. Unconsciously, you pick it up, even though consciously you're not aware. And then all of a sudden, you're 19, 20, you think the most romantic thing is giving someone something unexpected. But you might not be able to actually pinpoint that specific memory. Are people following me so far? So all of a sudden, you understand, oh, a love language, to be in a loving relationship, what does it mean to express love? And there's individuals who physical touch is not a way to express love. There's other people who might say, look, the best way to express love is acts of service or acts of kindness. It's, I know you love coffee, so if I wake up before you, I'm going to make us both a cup of coffee. It's buying you something or doing something for you, giving you a service. Hey, I know you have a long day of work. You get pains and aches, I'll give you a massage when you come home. That could be an act of love. That could be a way that you show your love and show your intimacy. Or for some, it could be just not talking about it. Like, yeah, I like you and I think you're great, but I'm never actually going to tell you that. Because why would I? You already know you're great. That's why we're dating. So the tricky thing becomes, what happens when you're used to, or excuse me, rather, when you're not used to physical touch at a young age? And now you're 18, 19, 20 to 25, you start dating. And when people try to be physically intimate, it makes you uncomfortable. Because that's frankly something that's foreign to you. Now, let's take it a step further. We talked about modeling, we talked about love languages and the implications they have from a young age all the way to young adulthood, and then some. Now let's talk about what abuse and trauma does. If you have a hothead, and this is very common, no, I shouldn't say very common, this is one of the more cliche or talked about things, is if there's a male figure in your home who has problems regulating his emotions, who may have anger problems, and that anger manifests itself in yelling, screaming, pushing, throwing things. What that child is learning is how to survive with this male figure. What does that mean? For example, that might mean when dad comes home at 6, do not let him see you because he's in a bad mood for work. And if he sees me, he's going to take it out on me. So when he comes home, I don't want to be there. If dad says something to me, I will not respond. I will not look at him in the eyes. Otherwise, he'll think I'm being confrontational. He'll yell at me, and who knows what could happen. And what we end up doing is we end up activating our fight or flight response. So psychologically, we start, it's actually very logical. I'm afraid of something bad happening. So let me look at the signs. Oh, when dad comes home from work, he's mad. He's looking for someone to yell at. If I go in my room and stay by myself, then I'm safe. And what this psychological thoughts leads to is very real physiological symptoms, which could show up in the way of anxiety, heart rate increasing, sweaty palms, feeling nauseous, stomach ache, difficulty sleeping. So now imagine you take that young girl or young guy, they start dating, and they're at their partner's place, and let's say maybe they've moved in, and when their partner's coming home from work at 5 or 6 p.m., guess what happens? The heart rate increases, the palms get sweaty, they start feeling nauseous. Because the conditioned response, what they've learned to survive, is being activated. So their brain has learned to get into fight or flight mode. Oh, so-and-so is coming home from work. I better get distant because I don't want to get yelled at. And even though we tell ourselves, but look, this is my boyfriend, this is my brother, this is my coworker, this is not my father, it's like this individual's brain has been wired to get into fight or flight mode. So if they don't feel well, they're not going to run up to the door and give them a big hug. And it can take a very long time to overcome, to undo that wiring that was so important. Look, there's this classic saying, don't forget what brought you to the dance, okay? And maybe at some point in your life, there was a certain skill or a thing that you did. Not only was it good, but it was essential to you getting by. One of the coolest movies I've ever seen is Shrek. If you haven't seen it, see it. In Shrek 2, Shrek is going to meet Fiona's parents, okay? And the very things that have helped him up to this part in life, being intimidating, being scary, being an ogre, being a monster, scaring people off, when he goes and meets her parents, he has to fight against himself to lean away or to try not to engage in those things that were so beneficial early on. Because when he lived on his swamp, being scary and intimidating was great. Now you put him in a palace with a bunch of royals and they're sitting around a table, being scary and intimidating isn't good anymore. Imagine you take a guy who was in prison. In prison, he needed to be rough and tough. He needed to be able to beat people up and mean mug them. and have a look of, I'm going to take your head off, so don't even think about coming over here. Now you take him out and you put him in a park in a picnic with his friends or with his family members. And then strangers walk by, maybe people look at them, maybe they're people watching. It takes time to unwire those things of, are they coming over here? Are they here to pick on me? Are they here to beat me up? Are they going to take my food? So there's certain things that individuals learn that are essential to them getting by. And yet, when we find ourselves in an environment where those skills are no longer needed, where that aggression, where that toughness is no longer needed, at least in that environment, in that context, it takes time to undo. It takes time to be able to lean back. So the fact of the matter is this. A lot of people face hardships when they're growing up. People suffer. People face pain. People face loss. It's inevitable. Now, on a scale, you could argue that some people suffer more than others, or the level of intensity or severity might be greater. And the really tricky thing becomes is when someone has baggage, as my biology teacher would call it, is, you meet someone and then you on the first date you try to hide it all and go, I'm perfectly well and I'm happy and everything's great. And then as dates proceed, you've got all these skeletons in your closet and you go, okay, well, I don't want to scare you off, but I also don't want to lie to you about what's going on or what has been done or why I am the way that I am. And here's the other thing that gets scary. It's scary to be in a relationship. It is. Why? Because to be in a relationship means to be vulnerable. You make yourself vulnerable to being heartbroken. When you care about somebody and you let them into your life and you start telling them about yourself, there's the chance that they could walk out at any moment. And that's scary. So we make ourselves vulnerable. And folks, it takes courage to be vulnerable. It's a very courageous thing to do. So the tricky thing becomes, we are shaped a lot by our childhood, but that doesn't mean we can't change in the future. However, what happens a lot of times in dating is you meet people, you go on a few dates, and then a person does a certain thing, or says it a certain way, or has a certain personality. And you sit there and you go, I don't like that. And maybe if you go deeper, you might think, I wonder where that comes from. I wonder where she or he gets that from. And then maybe you meet their parents or someone and you're like, oh, that's where it comes from. And there's a lot of baggage and trauma and stuff that you can look past. There's a lot of stuff that a person can change and modify and work on. But there's some stuff that is so heavily ingrained that even with the help of therapy, it can be extremely difficult to overcome. Does having some form of childhood trauma make you unlovable? No. But it opens up the discussion to, what does love look like to you? What does expressing love look like to you? Going back to the earlier example, if there wasn't any physical touch when you were younger with your parents, what happens when you get a romantic partner and they want to put their arm around you? It's something that you're not used to and it could make you feel uncomfortable. And then your partner's thinking, is it me? Do you not like me anymore? Am I doing something wrong? What happens when you grow up in a home where one parent yells a lot and they get angry and they have a temper tantrum? And maybe you learn to be submissive, to be docile, to agree with everything. Because if I don't agree, you're going to yell. All of a sudden, you get into a relationship with that same mentality. You start agreeing with everything your partner says, but deep down, you don't really agree. So now you feel dissatisfied with the relationship. You feel dissatisfied about yourself because you agreed with something that you didn't actually want to agree with. Now you don't have a backbone. Now you need assertiveness training. But you're so worried about conflict. You're so worried about confrontation. And the idea of what an argument means, oh, arguments are bad because arguments always lead to yelling. How do you think that's going to influence this person's long-term relationships? So, my dear friends, I end this one like I end most. It's complicated. Please have patience with yourselves and with your loved ones. And with strangers. You don't know what they're going through. You don't know the baggage that they're carrying with them. Just be open-minded. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.